The night of June 28, 1942, brought no moon to the steppes above the Don River, only a bruised and starless sky that swallowed sound as completely as it did light. Somewhere in the darkness, three primitive biplanes, Polikarpov Po-2s, wooden-framed and fabric-skinned relics from another era, cut their engines and began to glide. The only sound was the wind whistling through their bracing wires, a spectral whisper that German soldiers would later describe as the approach of witches on broomsticks. But there were no supernatural forces aboard these aircraft, only women, young Soviet pilots and navigators, most barely out of their teens, who had volunteered for what their commanders considered a suicide mission. At the controls of the lead plane sat Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a 32-year-old flight instructor from the Kuban region, her hand steady on the stick despite the primitive instruments before her and the 50 kilograms of bombs hanging beneath her wings. She had not asked for this command. When Marina Raskova, the famous Soviet aviatrix, had approached her earlier that year with a proposal to lead an all-female aviation regiment, Bershanskaya had initially refused. She was a teacher, not a combat commander. She had spent the 1930s training pilots at the Krasnodar Aero Club, watching the sun rise over the Caucasus Mountains with students who would become mail carriers and crop dusters, not warriors. But the war had changed everything. By June 1942, the Wehrmacht's Army Group South was driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalingrad lay exposed to the west, and the Soviet Union was bleeding aircraft and aircrew at a catastrophic rate. Raskova had used her direct line to Stalin to create 3 all-female aviation units, and she needed experienced leaders. Bershanskaya, with her 4,000 hours of flight time and unflappable demeanor, was the only choice for what would become the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The transformation from instructor to combat commander had been brutal and swift. In April 1942, Bershanskaya had assembled her initial group of volunteers at Engels, a training base on the Volga River. The women who reported for duty were a cross-section of Soviet youth. Factory workers, students, school teachers, and collective farm girls who had learned to fly in aero clubs before the war. Many had never fired a weapon. Some had never seen a man die. Bershanskaya had 6 weeks to turn them into a military unit, and she approached the task with the methodical patience of a teacher who understood that panic killed more pilots than enemy fire. She drilled them in formation flying until their reflexes replaced their thoughts, in night navigation, using only landmarks and dead reckoning, in the delicate art of cutting their engines at precisely the right altitude to glide silently toward targets. The Po-2, designed in 1928 as a trainer and crop duster, became their weapon of necessity. With a top speed of barely 150 kilometers per hour, slower than most German fighters could fly without stalling, the aircraft seemed laughably obsolete against the Messerschmitts dominating the daytime skies. But Bershanskaya recognized what others missed. At night, speed mattered less than silence, and the Po-2's simple construction made it nearly invisible to radar. Its wooden frame gave no radar return, and its 100-horsepower engine, when throttled back, produced a sound indistinguishable from the wind. By late May, the regiment was declared operational and assigned to the 218th Night Bomber Division of the 4th Air Army, operating in the sector of the North Caucasus Front. Their first missions were reconnaissance flights and leaflet drops, testing German anti-aircraft defenses while building the confidence of crews who had never flown in combat. Bershanskaya flew every early mission herself, refusing to ask her pilots to attempt maneuvers she hadn't first perfected. She developed the tactics that would define the regiment: approach targets at low altitude with engines running, cut power at the last moment to glide over the objective, release bombs by hand from the open cockpit, then restart the engine and dive away before searchlights could lock on. It was flying that demanded absolute precision. Too high, and the glide would carry them past the target. Too low, and they risked crashing into trees or power lines in the darkness. The Po-2 had no radio equipment to speak of, no oxygen for high altitude, no armor plating to protect the crew from ground fire. Each mission was a calculus of risk, and Bershanskaya kept meticulous records in a leather journal she carried in her flight suit. Weather conditions, moon phases, flak patterns, the psychological state of her crews. She noted which pilots could handle the stress of repeated low-altitude attacks and which needed rest, who had the spatial awareness for navigation by starlight, and who required more training. By June, she had identified her core group, 28 crews she trusted to execute the most dangerous missions. The summer of 1942 brought the crucible that would forge the regiment's legend and test Brzezinski's leadership to its limits. As German forces drove towards Stalingrad, the 588th was transferred north to the Stalingrad front, operating from makeshift airfields on the eastern bank of the Volga. The conditions were primitive even by Soviet standards. Dirt strips illuminated by bonfires for night landings, tents for barracks, irregular supplies of fuel and ammunition. The women slept in their flight suits during the long white nights of July, ready to scramble whenever intelligence identified German concentrations. Brzezinski established a rhythm of operations that maximized their limited resources. 2 waves of aircraft, the first attacking just after full darkness when German night fighters were still warming their engines, the second in the pre-dawn hours when exhausted anti-aircraft crews had begun to relax their vigilance. She rotated her crews strictly, refusing to let anyone fly more than 1 mission per night regardless of their eagerness, knowing that fatigue killed as surely as 88mm shells. The psychological toll mounted with each sortie. Her pilots returned with stories of tracer fire, rising like luminous fountains around their aircraft, of searchlight beams so bright they could read their instruments by their glare, of the sickening moment when an engine failed to restart and they plummeted toward the ground before the propeller finally caught. Brzezinski listened to each debriefing with complete attention, offering neither false comfort nor empty praise, only practical analysis of what had gone right and what could be improved. She had no time for the sentimentality that male commanders often displayed toward female units. These were combat pilots, and she treated them with the same professional standards she would have applied to any regiment. The title of the documentary you are about to experience captures the essence of what these women accomplished against impossible odds. The all-female World War II unit that glided in silence to bomb Nazi targets. By August 1942, German soldiers had begun to speak of the Nachwachsen with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The nickname spread through Wehrmacht ranks, passed in letters home, and whispered in field hospitals where men suffering from what doctors called Nervenkrankheit claimed they could no longer sleep for listening to the wind. Brzezinski learned of the name from captured German documents and felt a grim satisfaction. Psychological warfare had not been her intention, but she recognized its value. She encouraged her crews to exploit the effect, varying their attack patterns to prevent the enemy from adapting, sometimes sending single aircraft to circle German positions for hours, engines cut, dropping no bombs but preventing any rest for the troops below. The strain on her own pilots worried her more than she admitted. She kept a separate notebook tracking the combat shakes, the trembling hands, the insomnia, the sudden weeping that afflicted even her best crews after sustained operations. She instituted mandatory rest periods, organized singing sessions and poetry readings to maintain morale, and personally visited the medical tent each evening to check on wounded pilots. The regiment had no assigned doctor. Brzezinski had requisitioned a physician from a nearby infantry unit and threatened to fly her complaints to Moscow if he was removed. She was learning that command meant not merely tactics, but logistics, politics, and the endless work of maintaining human beings in conditions designed to break them. The autumn of 1942 brought a transformation in the scale and intensity of operations. As the Battle of Stalingrad settled into its brutal siege pattern, with German 6th Army clinging to the western bank of the Volga, the 588th found itself assigned to the most critical sector. Their airfield at Verkhnaya Oktyabr, 20 kilometers southeast of Stalingrad, placed them within minutes of German positions, but also within range of Luftwaffe fighter bombers that made daylight existence perilous. Brzezinski organized her ground crews with the same precision she applied to flight operations. Aircraft dispersed in individual earthen revetments, camouflaged with branches and netting, fuel, and ammunition stored separately to limit damage from any single hit. She instituted a strict blackout protocol after a German night fighter strafed the field in September, killing 2 mechanics and destroying 3 Po-2s. The women learned to sleep through the sound of engines and gunfire, to eat cold rations rather than risk smoke from cooking fires, to recognize the particular whine of approaching Junkers, 88s, and die for the nearest slit trench. Bershanskaya herself rarely slept more than 3 hours, rising before dawn to review maintenance logs, meeting with division intelligence officers to select targets for the coming night, flying the most dangerous missions herself when crews were exhausted or morale required their commander's example. The tactical evolution of the regiment during this period reflected Bershanskaya's growing sophistication. She developed coordination with ground artillery units, timing her bombing runs to coincide with Soviet barges so that German anti-aircraft batteries would be distracted. She experimented with chain attacks, where successive waves of Po-2s would strike the same target at 15-minute intervals, preventing German engineers from extinguishing fires. She established liaison with partisan units operating behind German lines, using their radio reports to identify supply convoys and headquarters positions. The Po-2's limitations remained constant. Its payload of 6 50-kilogram bombs could barely damage a concrete bunker, but Bershanskaya learned to leverage these constraints into advantages. The aircraft's low speed allowed remarkably accurate bombing from altitudes of 200 meters or less, and its ability to operate from unprepared fields meant the regiment could deploy forward as quickly as the infantry advanced. By October 1942, she had established a mobile command system, 3 forward operating detachments, each with 6 aircraft that could relocate within hours to support local offensives. She spent increasing time with these forward elements, sleeping in haylofts and commandeered peasant huts, eating whatever local collective farms could spare. The turning point of the Stalingrad campaign came on November 19, 1942, when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, the massive pincer movement designed to encircle Germany's 6th Army. The 588th was tasked with supporting the northern thrust, flying continuous missions against German artillery positions, supply columns, and headquarters units. The weather turned brutal. Freezing fog that coated wings with ice, ground temperatures of minus 20 degrees that made engine starts treacherous, winds that scattered bombers across the steppe. Bershanskaya flew as navigator for a novice pilot on the night of November 22nd, guiding her through zero visibility to a target that turned out to be a burning German fuel depot, flames rising 300 meters and illuminating their aircraft for every anti-aircraft gun in the sector. They survived by diving into the smoke column itself, emerging blind and coughing above a landscape of fire, Bershanskaya's flight goggles cracked by the heat. She landed with frostbitten fingers and a new understanding of what her pilots endured on every mission. The encirclement of 6th Army created new tactical challenges that Bershanskaya addressed with characteristic innovation. German forces trapped within the pocket maintained formidable anti-aircraft defenses, knowing their survival depended on the air bridge Göring had promised. The 588th was assigned to attack the airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak, requiring penetrating the densest concentration of flak on the Eastern Front. Bershanskaya studied German patterns for a week before committing her regiment, noting that the heaviest fire came from batteries protecting approach corridors while the fields themselves were more lightly defended. She devised a new approach, flying in from the east over the frozen Volga, using the river's ice as visual reference, then cutting engines to glide the final 3 kilometers where German guns could not depress sufficiently to target low-flying aircraft. The first mission using this approach, on December 8, 1942, destroyed 4 German transport aircraft on the ground and damaged the runway sufficiently to close it for 6 hours. Bershanskaya led the attack herself, returning with her Po-2 riddled by machine gun fire from a German fighter, the fabric of her wings punctured by 23 holes that ground crews patched overnight. By January 1943, the regiment had been redesignated as the 46 Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, Taman, receiving the honorific for its role in liberating the Taman Peninsula. The spring of 1943 brought a transformation in the strategic context of the Eastern Front that required Brzezinski to adapt her regiment's tactics to entirely new operational environments. As Soviet forces pushed across the thawing steppes of the Donbass in Ukraine, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment found itself advancing westward, supporting offensives that recaptured territory lost in the catastrophic summer of 1942. The mobile warfare of pursuit and exploitation differed fundamentally from the static siege conditions around Stalingrad. Brzezinski had to develop procedures for operating from captured German airfields, often before Soviet engineers could clear the mines and booby traps left by retreating forces. She established a reconnaissance protocol that sent ground crews ahead of the main body to inspect potential landing sites, learning to read the signs of German sabotage, disturbed earth around fuel storage tanks, tripwires in apparently abandoned buildings, subtle alterations to runway surfaces designed to collapse under landing aircraft. The regiment's first operation from a former German base at Kramatorsk in March 1943 nearly ended in disaster when a delayed action mine destroyed a Po-2 during takeoff, killing both crew members. Brzezinski ordered a complete halt to operations, personally inspected every meter of the runway with a mine detector borrowed from Army engineers, and refused to allow flights to resume until she had verified the field's safety. The 12-hour delay drew criticism from division commanders, but she accepted the reprimand without argument, knowing that the lives of her crews outweighed any temporary tactical advantage. The changing nature of German opposition demanded continuous tactical innovation. As the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Dnieper River line, its night defenses grew more sophisticated. The Germans had learned to respect the night witches, deploying additional searchlight batteries and radar-directed anti-aircraft guns along retreat routes. Brzezinski studied captured German equipment and documents to understand these new capabilities, working with division intelligence officers to identify radar station locations and frequencies. She developed countermeasures that proved effective against 1943 technology, flying at altitudes below radar coverage, using terrain masking to hide from detection, varying approach routes to prevent pattern analysis. She also recognized the psychological dimension of technological asymmetry. German soldiers had been told that Soviet women were primitive and incapable of operating complex machinery. The very existence of an effective all-female aviation unit undermined this propaganda. When division headquarters captured German documents referring to the regiment as an irregular unit employing criminal elements and degenerate females, she had the text translated and posted in the ready room, knowing that anger would sustain her crews through missions that fear might otherwise prevent them from completing. The summer campaign of 1943 brought the largest armored confrontation in history at Kursk, and the 46 Guards found themselves supporting the defensive phase before transitioning to counteroffensive operations. Brzezinski's regiment was assigned to the Central Front under Marshal Rokossovsky, operating where German 9th Army attempted to break through the northern face of the Kursk salient. The density of anti-aircraft defenses in this prepared battlefield exceeded anything previously encountered. Layered belts of 88mm guns, automatic weapons, and searchlights that created artificial daylight over German concentrations. Brzezinski modified her tactics for these conditions, abandoning low-altitude approaches in favor of toss bombing, techniques developed through spring experimentation. Pilots would approach at moderate altitude, cut engines to glide, then release bombs in a climbing maneuver that carried the aircraft away while the bombs continued in a ballistic arc. The method sacrificed accuracy for crew survival, and Brzezinski restricted its use to area targets where precision mattered less than sustained attack. She flew demonstration missions herself, calculating release points through trial and error until she could teach the technique with confidence. The aftermath of Kursk, when Soviet forces transitioned to continuous offensive operations, tested the regiment's endurance in ways Brzezinski had anticipated but could not fully prevent. The pace accelerated. 3, sometimes 4 missions per night for experienced crews, continuous relocation as the front moved westward, grinding attrition of aircraft and personnel. She maintained her system of rotation and rest with increasing difficulty, often finding herself with barely enough qualified pilots to meet operational requirements while preserving mandatory rest periods. She appealed repeatedly to division headquarters for replacements, receiving a trickle of graduates from Raskova's women's flight training program. These newcomers required integration into veteran crews, a process Brushanskaya supervised personally, pairing inexperienced pilots with navigators who had completed 50 or more missions. She also developed a training program for navigators to qualify as emergency pilots, knowing that combat damage often left one crew member dead or incapacitated and the survivor needed skills to bring the aircraft home alone. The psychological toll of sustained operations manifested in ways Brushanskaya documented with clinical precision but addressed with intuitive compassion. She maintained a combat effectiveness index for each pilot, tracking mission completion rates, decision-making quality under stress, recovery time after close calls, ability to sleep and eat normally. Pilots who scored below threshold were grounded for technical retraining, covering both skill refreshment and psychological recovery. She established informal support structures, the Night Sisters, pairs who shared quarters and provided mutual emotional support. The Letter Circle, a system of writing to families of killed crew members distributed across the entire regiment. The Morning Songs, mandatory group singing after night operations that forced exhausted women to engage respiratory systems and prevent physical collapse. These innovations emerged from Brushanskaya's observation of her own needs. She had developed insomnia, so severe she could only sleep 2 hours before waking with her heart racing. Managing this through rigorous physical exercise and absolute prohibition of alcohol enforced equally upon herself and her subordinates. The autumn of 1943 brought the regiment to the Dnieper River, the great natural barrier that German forces had prepared as their next offensive line. The river crossing operations of September and October required intensive night bombing support to suppress German artillery and prevent reinforcement of the bridgeheads established by Soviet assault troops. Brushanskaya developed specialized techniques for these missions, using the river's surface as a visual reference for navigation and targeting, exploiting the confusion created by Soviet engineering operations to mask the sound of approaching aircraft. She personally led the first mission against German positions on the western bank, flying through anti-aircraft fire so intense that it illuminated the clouds from below, dropping her bombs on a headquarters complex identified by partisan intelligence, and returning with her Po-2's rudder cables damaged by a near-miss from an exploding shell. The mission established a pattern for the subsequent weeks: continuous harassment of German forces attempting to organize their defenses, prevention of any stable night environment that would allow rest or resupply, contribution to the psychological collapse that would eventually force the abandonment of the Dnieper line. By November 1943, the regiment had flown 7,000 sorties and been credited with the destruction of 3 bridges, 11 ammunition dumps, and countless vehicles and artillery pieces. These statistics appeared in official citations accompanying the regiment's receipt of the Order of the Red Banner. But Brushanskaya valued more highly the maintenance of unit cohesion through conditions that had destroyed less carefully led formations. The winter of 1943-44 brought operational conditions that tested the fundamental assumptions of night bomber warfare. As Soviet forces pushed across the Dnieper and established bridgeheads in eastern Ukraine, the regiment found itself operating in an environment of fluid, unpredictable combat where front lines shifted daily. The advanced airfield at Konev, established in December 1943, placed them within range of German positions, but also exposed them to counterattack by German armored forces. Brushanskaya organized her ground defense with the same attention she applied to air operations. Trenches dug in a perimeter around the dispersal area, machine guns positioned to cover approach routes, a system of ground alerts that could scramble all available pilots into the air within 3 minutes if German tanks appeared. She maintained this dual capability through the winter months, sleeping with a submachine gun beside her cot and her flight suit laid out for instant departure. The psychological strain of this divided attention accumulated in ways she could not fully acknowledge, manifesting in a tremor of her left hand that she concealed by keeping in her pocket during briefings and using only her right for demonstrations. The German response to Soviet advances included increasingly desperate measures against the night bomber threat. By early 1944, Luftwaffe night fighter units had begun specifically targeting the Po-2 formations, developing tactics that exploited the biplanes' vulnerabilities. German pilots learned to patrol at very low altitude, below normal radar operating height, using searchlight illumination and visual identification to locate Soviet aircraft. They also developed acoustic detection systems, networks of ground microphones that could triangulate Po-2 engine positions and vector fighters to intercept. Bershansky studied these developments through captured equipment and prisoner interrogations, adapting her tactics in response. She reduced engine running time to absolute minimums, cutting power at greater distances from targets and accepting the navigation challenges of longer glides. She varied approach altitudes and routes to prevent pattern recognition, sometimes approaching from unexpected directions that required pilots to navigate by memory and intuition rather than familiar landmarks. She also developed coordination with Soviet night fighter units, arranging for protection during the most vulnerable phases of return flights when her pilots were exhausted and their aircraft low on fuel. The spring thaw of 1944 transformed the Ukrainian landscape into a sea of mud that grounded conventional aviation for days, but affected the lightweight Po-2 less severely. Bershansky exploited this comparative advantage, maintaining operations through conditions that stopped heavier aircraft, striking German positions while their own air support was immobilized. She developed techniques for operating from roads and fields when airfields became unusable, marking improvised landing sites with hooded lanterns and maintaining mobile fuel caches that could be relocated as the front moved. These innovations required extraordinary physical effort from her ground crews, mostly women who found themselves hauling fuel drums through knee-deep mud, camouflaging aircraft in open country, repairing battle damage with hand tools in freezing rain. Bershansky worked alongside them when not flying, knowing that her presence meant more than any verbal recognition, that the commander who shared their hardships earned loyalty that no decoration could purchase. She established a rotation system bringing forward aircrew back to the main base for rest, personally inspecting every aircraft that returned from forward detachments, noting stress fractures in wooden spars, fabric patches covering shrapnel holes, oil leaks indicating engine were beyond safe limits. The summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, brought the regiment to the borders of pre-war Poland and confrontation with a new phase of the war. The massive Soviet breakthrough in Belorussia destroyed German Army Group Center and opened a route to East Prussia, but also brought the night witches into contact with populations whose loyalties were uncertain and whose knowledge of Soviet female combatants was non-existent. Bershansky had developed protocols for operating in this politically sensitive environment, emphasizing discipline and correct behavior toward civilians. She prohibited foraging without proper documentation, established compensation for damaged property, and personally investigated any complaints against her personnel. These measures reflected her belief that the regiment represented something more than military utility, that the participation of women in combat required higher standards of conduct to overcome prejudice. The regiment's survival depended on local support for intelligence, emergency landing assistance, medical care of wounded crew members. Bershansky cultivated relationships with Polish communist partisans, Red Cross organizations, village elders who could provide guides and translators. She learned basic Polish phrases and required her pilots to do the same, recognizing that the human dimension of warfare extended beyond the immediate exchange of fire. The final months of the war brought a paradoxical combination of triumph and emptiness that Bershansky navigated with the same steady determination she had applied to every previous challenge. As Soviet forces closed on Berlin in April 1945, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment found itself operating in support of the 1st Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov, participating in a massive artillery preparation and ground assault that would eventually capture the German capital. The density of anti-aircraft defenses around Berlin exceeded anything previously encountered. Thousands of guns of all calibers, radar systems operating with desperate precision, night fighters that rose to meet the Po-2s with a fury born of knowledge that defeat was imminent. Brzezinskaya modified her tactics for this ultimate test, abandoning the glide attacks that had defined the regiment's identity in favor of high-speed approaches at maximum engine power, accepting the increased detection risk for the reduced exposure time of faster transit. She also developed coordination with the massive Soviet artillery bombardment, timing her attacks to coincide with the heaviest barges when German gun crews sought shelter. The regiment's final missions over Berlin, on the nights of April 28th to 30th, struck at the remaining German command centers and communication facilities while Soviet ground forces fought their way into the city center. Brzezinskaya led the last attack herself, dropping her bombs on a position near the Tiergarten that intelligence had identified as a final headquarters complex, returning to base with her Po-2's fabric covering torn by blast fragments and her navigator wounded by a shell fragment. They landed at 3:47 a.m. on April 30th, 1945, unaware that Hitler would be dead by afternoon and the war in Europe effectively concluded. The immediate aftermath of victory brought challenges that Brzezinskaya had not anticipated. The regiment was ordered to relocate to a captured airfield outside Berlin, where they would participate in occupation duties and eventual repatriation. She confronted the practical problems of maintaining discipline among crews who had suddenly lost their defining purpose, managing relationships with German civilians who now depended on Soviet forces for survival, processing the accumulated grief and trauma that combat operations had suppressed. She established a routine of maintenance and training that provided structure, organized educational programs about reconstruction tasks ahead, and personally conducted counseling sessions with pilots who found themselves weeping uncontrollably or unable to sleep in the silence that replaced the constant engine noise of war. She also addressed the material needs of her crews, securing adequate rations and housing, preventing the looting that characterized some Soviet units, establishing medical care for the wounded and psychological support for the traumatized. These tasks required skills different from combat command: administrative persistence, political negotiation, emotional intelligence. But she applied herself with the same methodical dedication that had characterized her flying career. The return to the Soviet Union in June 1945 brought official recognition that Brzezinskaya received with characteristic modesty. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment was credited with 24,000 combat sorties and 23,000 tons of bombs dropped. Individual pilots had flown as many as 1,000 missions, a total that seemed impossible by Western standards where 50 missions typically completed a combat tour. Brzezinskaya herself had flown 89 combat missions, a modest number reflecting her command responsibilities, but had led from the front in the most dangerous operations. She was awarded the Order of Suvorov, the Order of the Red Banner, and numerous other decorations, promoted to lieutenant colonel. The regiment received the Order of Lenin, the highest unit decoration, and participated in the Victory Parade on Red Square. Brzezinskaya led her pilots through Moscow, past the reviewing stand where Stalin stood with Allied commanders, feeling the strange disconnection between this ceremonial celebration and the reality of what they had endured. She noticed that many of her pilots wept during the parade, not from joy, but from the release of tension that had sustained them through years of nightly mortal danger. The post-war period brought a gradual dissolution of the regiment that Brzezinskaya resisted but could not prevent. The all-female aviation units had been created as emergency measures for total war, and the Soviet military had no intention of maintaining them in peacetime. She fought to preserve her unit's identity, arguing that the experience accumulated by her pilots represented irreplaceable national assets, that the demonstration of female combat capability had political value, that the bonds of sisterhood forged in war should not be casually broken. She succeeded in delaying demobilization for several months, securing preferential treatment for her veterans in assignment to civilian aviation or continued military service, establishing a regimental association to maintain contact among survivors. But she could not prevent the eventual dispersal of her pilots to distant cities and separate lives, the reassignment of aircraft to training units or scrapyards, the transformation of living history into archived memory. She herself was assigned to the Frunze Military Academy for advanced command training, a recognition that also removed her from the environment where her capabilities had developed. She completed the course with distinction, but found theoretical study less satisfying than practical warfare. Yevdokia Brzezinski died in 1982 at age 72, having outlived most of her wartime comrades. Her obituaries emphasized her decorations and command of the famous regiment, but could not fully convey the quality of leadership that had sustained an experimental unit through conditions that destroyed less carefully commanded formations. The historical assessment of her contributions has evolved in the decades since, as scholars have gained access to archival materials and the experience of women in combat has become a subject of serious study. She emerges as a figure of remarkable practical intelligence, a commander who understood that military effectiveness depends on human sustainability, who recognized that her unit's unique capabilities required unique methods of support, who maintained the distinction between necessary violence and gratuitous cruelty in circumstances that blurred such distinctions for many. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, Tamon, the Night Witches, remains the most decorated female unit in aviation history, and Brzezinski's leadership was essential to its achievement. The title of this documentary, the all-female World War II unit that glided in silence to bomb Nazi targets, captures the operational essence of what they accomplished, but the full story includes the human dimensions of courage, endurance, and mutual commitment that she cultivated and preserved through the longest nights of the war.